Welcome to the Lean Blog Podcast. Visit our website at www.leanblog.org. Now, here's your host, Mark Graban.
Hi, this is Mark Graban. Welcome to podcast number 143 for April 5th, 2012. Like episode 133, this one is a Q&A as a follow-up to a webinar that I did recently. And so in our introduction, Ron Pereira from Gemba Academy will talk about where you can find and watch and listen to a recording of that webinar, so that maybe this Q&A about SPC, Statistical Process Control, and its application to better management decision-making can actually seem more relevant or interesting. I've got a lot of great podcasts coming up in the next couple of weeks. Natalie Sayer, the author of the newly revised Lean for Dummies, we'll have Dr. Dean Gruner, the CEO of ThedaCare Health System, talking about Lean and ACOs, or Accountable Care Organizations. Lots of great stuff coming up, so I hope you'll stay tuned. Subscribe via iTunes. You can find more info at leanpodcast.org. Thanks for listening. Well, again, welcome to the podcast. As we did once before, we're kind of turning the tables on the usual format. We've got Ron Pereira from Gemba Academy, and Ron and the good folks there hosted a webinar that I did recently about using SPC, or Statistical Process Control, to help make better management decisions. It may sound like a terribly dry topic, but I think we had managed to have some fun with the webinar. So we're going to do some follow-up Q&A, and I'm going to go ahead and turn the reins over to Ron here.
All right, Mark. Well, before we get into the questions, I just wanted to let everybody know that we're going to have the webinar, a replay of the webinar that Mark did, which was fantastic. Great job, Mark. We'll have a link to it, but it's leanblog.org, so leanblog.org, and then /SPC webinar. So it's leanblog.org /SPC webinar. And we'll have that webinar up for free for 30 days, so anybody can check that out. And then after that, we'll include that into Gemba Academy's complete Lean package of videos that we offer. So leanblog.org /SPC webinar. Check that out. And Mark has also made the slides available on SlideShare. And so we'll have a link to that as well that you can check out. So good stuff there, Mark. And just, if anybody's interested, we do cover a lot of this SPC topic in Gemba Academy's course called the 7 Quality Control Tools. And so you can learn about that at gembaacademy.com. All right, well, we've got 5 questions that we've kind of summarized, Mark. We had more than that, but many of them were asking kind of similar things, so we kind of consolidated it down to 5 questions. So the first one, an individual was curious on your techniques. Like during the webinar, you talked a little bit about what Wheeler calls XMR charts. So our X, sometimes we call them X bar MR charts. And the question was, how do you interpret the X chart with the moving range chart? How do you use those two in harmony?
Right, yeah, and the textbook approach is to use those charts together. The X chart plots the actual data that we're looking at, whether that's, let's say, a monthly patient satisfaction score. So we're charting that, and then we draw control limits around that data. Then the MR chart is a different measure of variation in that data. It shows we're plotting the relative, the absolute difference between each 2 data points. And so, we use those 2 charts together because either one of those charts can tell us when we've got a signal in a what we would call an out of control data point that signals that there's likely something worth investigating that we would call a special cause. And the best approach for using those charts together helps because you might have something in the X chart that looks in control, but the MR chart indicates a special cause. If there's more variation month to month than we would expect just through chance, that MR chart may tell us that, hey, this is likely not just noise in the system. And then there's times where The X chart will help us detect signals. So that's really why those two charts are helpful. And in times when I've done just the X chart, you have to be sort of mindful of not just looking at the data points, but looking for large jumps in those data points, and then maybe going back and doing or taking a closer look at a MR chart, even if you weren't really maintaining that in conjunction with the X chart.
Sure. Yeah, and just so, because nobody sees the emails that we get, but we had a lot of follow-up compliments on the Western Electric rules that you talked about in the webinar. So those are also rules that I think a lot of people need to be aware of, and we don't think enough about that. It's easy to see a signal or a special cause above the upper and lower control limits, but sometimes we forget about those other less talked about Western Electric rules. So that was great that you covered that, Mark.
Yeah, we've got a link in the slide share, or if somebody can just Google, do a search for Western Electric rules, SPC, and that's definitely something that's relatively simple. That helps you interpret those charts. Looking for a signal in the midst of that noise.
Sure. Good stuff, Mark. Okay, so question number 2. This was we've had a lot of discussion and chatter about this. So. Some people who might not be as aware of statistics may not have heard of this, but those that do study statistics know about a phrase called testing for normality. In the Six Sigma world, we talk about the Anderson-Darling normality test and checking if our data are normal before we apply different statistical tools. And so there is a big debate within the statistical world on whether or not our data should be normal before we look at using tools such as control charts, or even really as simple as looking at measures of central tendency. Should we talk about the average or the median? So, Mark, why don't you just maybe shed a little bit of insight, maybe just your opinion on this whole case for testing for normality as it relates to control charts?
Sure. And, there's times where, I think, there's a balance between what's accessible and easy for people to use as opposed to what is, 100% technically, statistically correct. And we don't want to be wildly incorrect in our use of statistical methods. But, I think, using this SPC approach is a very practical tool. I've never done those formal tests for normality. I did take a look back at some of the data sets that I shared during the presentation and just did some histograms, less formal than even doing a formal statistical test. And the data was roughly normal, which kind of gives me confidence that, okay, I think for this type of management data, I think we do tend to see that type of distribution. We're not doing an SPC chart on things with this method that might be exponentially distributed. But, Don Wheeler, has been part of that discussion. Don Wheeler, who I cited in his great book called Understanding Variation. Don Wheeler says that, and he's a PhD statistician. I'll take his word on this, that this control chart method is actually fairly robust, even in cases where you don't have perfectly normal data, or so I think Don Wheeler's point is to say, roughly, don't overcomplicate things. It's not worth doing all of that, and that even if the method's not 100% correct, I think the higher level lessons are still incredibly helpful, especially the idea that we need to not overreact to all the noise in the system, and I think the risk of this not being perfectly correct is that you may see a signal of a special cause when it doesn't really exist, or you may have something that looks normal and in control when there's really, something happening, a special cause. And, with any of these statistical methods, there's risk of seeing a signal when there's not one there, or vice versa. I guess, I'm just following his guidance to say, well, to some extent, it doesn't really matter so much, that this method still can be very helpful.
Yeah, and in my personal use of control charts, one thing I think people lose sight of is, the reason that we really want to use control charts, and we'll talk about this in a question coming up here, but we want to be using control charts on a regular basis, hopefully day-to-day basis, perhaps even hour-to-hour basis. And in these situations, we might be plugging along, and we might have some nice common cause variation, and all of a sudden something happens, and we go out of control with a signal or a special cause. Well, in that case, technically speaking, you have a couple signals or a couple special causes. This may turn our data into a non-normal data set, but you know what? It's the voice of the process, and that's what's happening. So I think sometimes there's a danger, and I've done this myself as a Six Sigma practitioner early in my career. You get presented with some data, and you've learned some tools, and you learn box-Cox transformations, and you get excited that, I'm going to use these tools, but you're really missing the point of, stop worrying about your spreadsheet and Minitab and go to Gemba, right? Go to the place the work is done and see what's happening with this data, and why is this data speaking to us the way it is. So sometimes I think we, and I'm speaking for myself here, I'm also a Six Sigma practitioner, where sometimes we get enamored with the tools and the power at our fingertips, and we lose sight of what we're really trying to do, which is study the process.
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree with what you're saying there, and especially the point that I'm certainly not trying to encourage that we completely manage our operation using charts.
Yeah.
That charts are one helpful approach, in addition to going to the Gemba, and I think even beyond that, having good visual management, where ideally, if we have good visual management and error proofing in our process, if there's a problem, the people working in that process detect it immediately. We're not waiting for somebody to see it in a daily SPC chart. That would be even better than the chart.
Sure. Good stuff. Okay, normality, always fun. Okay, so question 3. This was a great discussion we had with a person that was on the webinar, back and forth on email. And to summarize the conversation, the gist of it was, should we use control charts for end-of-month management reviews? What are your thoughts there, Mark?
Right. So, I showed some data in the examples that I had of daily control charts. I had some that was monthly data, and I think we can do both. I mean, we in some of our exchange, Ron, you made a great point that we want to be able to detect signals sooner rather than later, and in the case I showed in the webinar, the hospital lab that switched from just monthly data reporting to looking at things daily, they were able to do a better job of improving their process, because when you see a signal of something that happened yesterday, like, it's usually pretty easy to go through and troubleshoot and say, okay, what happened yesterday? When you're looking at monthly data, especially when you're looking at monthly averages, if the average performance was poor last month, people, they might not remember why, or, it's hard to tell if we had one or two really bad days in the month as opposed to performance being poor consistently all month. And, in the case of that lab, they still report monthly data, even though they're looking at the daily results. You can apply SPC limits and SPC thinking to any of the data, but I would certainly emphasize the more frequent review, the better, because you're going to be able to see that signal so that you can react to it and improve your process.
Yeah. The statement I think I shared in our email exchange with the gentleman was, the danger of really trying to just run your company or run your business through end of month reviews. It's similar to driving a car while looking in the rear view mirror. You're always looking backwards if you wait till the end of month review, versus using control charts or SPC on a day-to-day basis where, we can actually look forward and make sure we don't run into something, So I've always liked that.
Because the SPC charts help you make reasonable predictions of what future performance is going to be based on that statistical control. This is different than the financial ad warnings that say, past performance does not guarantee future results. When we have a stable in control process in a factory or a hospital, or data with our website, if it's stable and in control, we actually can, with pretty good certainty, predict future results. And if our data falls outside of those predicted bands, then we know something good happened or something bad happened.
Great. Yeah. Excellent. Excellent. Okay, number 4. So this question was related to humidity. So to summarize the question said we have process data on humidity, but we're not sure how that humidity actually impacts quality. So this individual wanted to know, how do we go about setting upper and lower control limits?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, Ron and I live in Texas. We know humidity. But, we look at, process behavior characteristics. And in fact, Don Wheeler, I think the term he uses now for this is process behavior charts, which is a good term because, the SPC methodology tells us, quote unquote, the voice of the process. So the upper and lower control limits are set based on that historical data. How is the process performing? And so there's nothing arbitrary about the upper and lower control limits. The process tells us what those limits are based on the normal expected variation in that data. And I think, the person asked the question may have been confusing a bit, and this is a really common thing, confusing the difference between our customer specification limits and our process behavior limits. So, the example of, let's say, lab turnaround time data, we had a control chart where, I think, let's say the mean was 40 minutes, the lower control limit was 30, the upper control limit is 50. If the customer requirement is to deliver those tests within 20 minutes, we would say, we have a process that's maybe stable. Those control limits of 30 and 50 minutes are set by the voice of the process. The voice of the customer says, we need those tests quickly. Our process isn't capable of meeting that customer specification. So I think, to the person who asked the question, I think that's what they were referring to. They're saying, well, our end product has quality requirements, quality characteristics. We don't know how to set those. Well, we need to be careful. We don't use the customer specifications as our control limits for the control chart. When we need to be careful to keep that all in line. Yeah. I mean, you've got experience with this. I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
The analogy we often use when we teach this is a garage. You're pulling your vehicle into the garage. Well, if you go out and you have a small garage and you hit the lottery, so you go buy this big Humvee or this huge vehicle, well, you know what? Your garage may not be big enough to hold that vehicle. Therefore, your garage is not capable. No matter how centered or how perfectly straight we drive that vehicle into the garage, it won't fit. It's not capable. So it's interesting because there was another question that we got that we didn't have on the list, but I'll just throw it in there. A gentleman asked, should I worry about stability or capability first? And my response was, you should definitely worry about stability first, because if you don't have a stable process, you can just forget about ever being capable of meeting your customer specifications. So worry about stabilizing your process first, and then we'll worry about, perhaps we've got to recenter or tweak the process to bring it into capability, but always want to focus on stability first.
Yeah, and so one other example comes to mind, looking at stability, the voice of the process versus the voice of the customer. You can apply. I've actually done this before. Let's say if you weigh yourself every morning and you chart that, there's going to be some variation day to day in your weight, and it's good to not, if you're trying to lose weight, not overreact to every single up and down in the system. And you can apply a control chart to your weight and look for process shifts. And you say, well, let's say baseline my weight on average was 190 pounds, and there's variation there. And then let's say if you're exercising and you're eating better, and you've been able to now have an average morning weight of 185, and you can see a process shift as we showed during the webinar, and saying, my average morning weight is now lower than it had been before. I can say, well, okay, wow, I've actually shown that I've lost some weight and had a shift in looking at that as a shift in that process, if you will, and not overreact to say, well, you could do all kinds of maybe unsafe things to drop 5 pounds in a day. That's probably not sustainable.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Okay. Last question, Mark. Number 5. Should we automate our SPC system?
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of things you can do. I mean, I think even more so in manufacturing settings where, when I worked in the auto industry, we had machining centers that, automatically gauged and measured every part that came out. These were engine blocks that we were machining. And actually, the one dysfunction there, something like that would be a great example when we talked about tampering. If you're adjusting the machine based on the measurement of every single part that you're making, chances are you're increasing variation in your production, which seems really counterintuitive to people to say, well, if that dimension was a little bit too big, let's tweak the settings so that it's smaller the next time. That can actually increase variation. But even if you're not tampering, if you're just trying to look at an automated control chart, I could see maybe where there's that may save some time in creating the chart. But my fear would be that if you're creating the chart in an automated way, it doesn't guarantee that somebody's actually going to look at the chart. And I've seen a lot of great applications, whether this was back in manufacturing in the mid-90s, or I see people doing this in hospitals today. You have the people right there in the process creating the chart with pen or pencil and paper, right on the wall. So rather than having the SPC chart created by a quality function who then has to run it out to the department, well, again, maybe nobody's looking at that. When people are charting their own process, there's that process of adding a new data point to the chart, extending the run chart line with your own hand. The process of doing that is also the process of evaluation. So, I think maybe there's room for balance, that you can have people doing daily charts by hand, and then maybe you roll that up and eventually make that into an electronic format. But I would be cautious of trying to completely automate that flow.
Very good. Okay, well, that's all the questions, Mark. So why don't we wrap this up with maybe just giving just a quick overview or summary of the webinar, the key themes and topics that you talked about.
Right. So, there's lots of great resources out there on how to do SPC charts. Don Wheeler's book, Understanding Variation, is a very accessible book. It's got a lot of great stories, and it's really focused on making good management decisions, of not falling into traps of just comparing two data points, last month versus this month, or this year versus last year. Lots of really, really applicable lessons in that book. And that was, again, I think the key theme of what I was trying to get across in the presentation, that we want to use the charts to make good decisions, of helping us not overreact to every up and down in the data, making sure that we do react when we see statistically meaningful data points or trends, and that we can use these methods to, I think, better gauge whether we're actually making improvements or not, whether we discover by looking at the chart that an improvement may have occurred, or when we make an improvement, we can use the control chart as a way of confirming, did we shift the process in a sustained, significant way. I think it's a better methodology than just eyeballing it or using a linear trend line or just doing a 2-point comparison. That's what I hope was going to be helpful from the webinar, that this isn't just a dry statistical topic, but this is something that we can really use to improve our statistical understanding and statistical literacy, and to ultimately manage in a better way and improve our business or organization. Great.
Well, all right, Mark. Well, good stuff. So again, if people want to watch this webinar, we'll have it up for 30 days. Just go to leanblog.org/SPC webinar, and you'll be able to see Mark in all of his glory. It was a great job. Yeah, that's right. Well, thanks again, Mark, for doing this. Really enjoyed it. We got a lot of great feedback, so hopefully we can do this again in the future. And that's all I have, Mark.
Yeah, well, thank you, and I appreciate that feedback and the good questions from people, and thanks again to Gemba Academy for hosting this and for all the great videos and training that you guys offer. So I would definitely encourage people to check that out, GembaAcademy.com, and I say that as as a friend of Ron's and Gemba Academies and having seen their product, not in it sounds like an advertisement, but I'm very sincere when I say, hey, there's some good stuff there, and it's worth checking out. So thanks for doing that, Ron.
All right. No, thank you, Mark. Okay. Take care.
You too.
Thanks for listening. This has been the Lean Blog Podcast. For Lean news and commentary updated daily, visit www.leanblog.org. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast, email Mark at leanpodcast@gmail.com.